Arizona Territory, October 1873. The sun was just starting to sink behind the red cliffs of the Mogollon Rim when the cowboys saw her. She was sitting on the steps of the tiny whitewashed church just outside the mining town of Pine Hollow, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking as if the grief inside her was too much to hold. Her dress was dusty, sleeves torn at the edges, and her dark brown hair had slipped out of its pins, falling messily around her face. Wesley Rourke pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, boots crunching on gravel as he approached. He kept his hat in hand out of respect, holding it against his chest. The sound of her crying made his throat tighten. "Ma'am?" His voice was quiet, careful. "Are you all right?" She looked up, startled, eyes red-rimmed and filled with tears. There was dirt on her cheeks and a rawness in her gaze that told him she had been holding herself together for too long. I do not know what to do," she whispered. Wesley crouched next to her, setting his hat on the step. "What happened?" She hesitated, then said in a hoarse voice. "My name is Susanna Ellery. My husband died 6 months ago. We came here for a fresh start. He found work in the mines. But when he passed, they stopped paying me. I have 2 children. William is 6. Stella just turned 4. I cannot feed them anymore. I sold my wedding ring for bread last week." Wesley's jaw clenched. He looked toward the small cemetery beside the church, where a few wooden crosses stood. Then he looked back at her, seeing the fear she was trying to hide. "Where are your children now?" he asked. "In the back room of the church. Pastor lets us sleep there," she said. "But he is leaving for Prescott tomorrow. He said he cannot keep us any more." Wesley stood slowly and held out his hand. "Come on. Let me help." She stared at his hand for a long moment. "Why would you help me?" "Because no mother should be sitting on church steps wondering how to keep her babies alive," he said, voice low. "And because you should not have to carry this alone." Her hand trembled in his, but she stood. She was thin, clearly hungry, but there was a quiet strength in the way she straightened her back. Inside the tiny church, the children lay on a cot made of horse blankets. William sat up when they entered, blue eyes wary. Stella stirred beside him. "Mama?" William asked, rubbing his eyes. "It is all right," Susanna said softly, brushing William's hair back. Wesley knelt beside them. "Name's Wesley Rourke. I have a small ranch about a half-day's ride north. Got room to sleep, food to eat, and hands that could use some help. If you come with me, I will treat you and your little ones right. No expectations, no strings." Susanna's eyes searched his. "Why?" "Because I was raised right. And because you deserve better than this." She looked down at her children, then back at him. Her voice cracked as she said, "I do not want charity." "It ain't charity," Wesley said. "It is kindness. And you can pay it back however you see fit." She wiped her face with the edge of her sleeve. "All right." By the time they rode out, dusk had fallen. Wesley had brought a second horse, an old mare named Clara. He lifted Stella gently into his arms, then helped Susanna mount behind him, William riding in front of her. The little boy clutched the saddle horn tight, and Susanna's arms wrapped protectively around him. They rode under a sky streaked with stars, the desert air cooling by the mile. Wesley kept an eye on them as they traveled. He did not speak much, but every now and then he glanced over and found Susanna watching him, something soft and uncertain in her eyes. When they reached the ranch, it was past midnight. The house was small but clean, a one-room cabin with a loft above. He had built it with his own hands 5 years back after leaving the army. There was a corral, a barn, and 2 cows in the paddock. He led them inside, lit the lantern, and set out a blanket in the corner for the children. "The bed is yours," he said to Susanna. "I will sleep outside." "You do not have to, I know," he said simply. "But I will." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you." He nodded once, then stepped outside into the night. Wesley did not sleep much. He sat on the porch, boots off, listening to the wind in the mesquite trees and the soft sounds of the desert. He had never expected to bring home a woman and her children. But something about the way she had looked on those church steps. It hit him hard. The next morning, Susanna made coffee over the fire. Her hands moved with practiced grace despite how thin she was. William helped carry water from the well, and Stella clung to her mother's skirt. Wesley watched from a distance, quietly stacking firewood. When she handed him a cup, their fingers brushed. She looked up at him, her eyes clearer now. "I did not expect to meet someone like you," she said. He looked down at her, voice quiet. "Neither did I." That evening, he came back from checking the fence line to find her sitting on the porch steps, watching the sunset. Her children were asleep inside. She turned when she heard him, her face lit by the last flicker of gold light. "I sat crying by the church," she said softly, "and now I am here." He stood in front of her, hat in his hands again. "And I will kneel beside you for a lifetime, Susanna Ellery. If you will let me." Her eyes filled again, but this time with something gentler. She reached her hand toward him. "I will." The morning air carried a bite, dry and sharp, as autumn settled deeper into the highlands. The grass had yellowed across the ridgelines, and the mesquite trees scattered their seed pods under the passing hooves of Wesley's gelding as he rode back from the creek with a string of trout tied at his saddle horn. The sun had barely crested the rim when he returned, and the cabin windows were already open, shutters propped to let in the light. Susanna stood at the wash-basin just outside the door, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands red from the cold water. She didn't glance up when he approached, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, not fear, exactly, but the kind of guardedness that came from too many months of watching the world tilt beneath her feet. "I brought breakfast," he said, holding up the trout. She looked over, brushing a wet curl back from her cheek. "They'll be glad of that," she said, her voice quieter than before, but steadier. Inside, Stella sat on a folded quilt, tugging the ears of a rag-stuffed cloth doll. William knelt beside her with a stick and a row of smooth stones, lining them up like soldiers. The children had slept through the night without stirring, a small mercy Wesley hadn't taken for granted. By midday, Wesley was out behind the barn, repairing a stretch of fence where the rails had warped. Susanna approached with a pail of water and a clean cloth tucked into her apron. He paused, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "You've got a splinter," she said, nodding at his left hand. He hadn't noticed, but now that she mentioned it, there was a dark shard lodged along his palm. She set the pail beside him and gently took his hand, her fingers dry and warm. She worked the splinter free with a bit of clean cloth and a sliver of bone-handled knife from her apron pocket. "You've done this before," he said. "My father was a cooper," she replied, not looking up. "I helped him when I was young. Used to pull splinters from his hands every week." He said nothing, but the silence felt companionable. When she finished, she folded her cloth and said, "There's yeast rising near the stove. I'll have bread ready by evening." Wesley nodded. "You're making this place steadier than it was." She didn't answer, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, not pride exactly, something softer. That night, they ate by lantern light. Stella fell asleep against her mother's hip, mouth stained with blackberry jam. William, yawning against his plate, leaned heavily on his elbow. "You built all of this yourself?" Susanna asked, her voice low so as not to wake the girl. "Every board," Wesley said, leaning back in his chair. "Took me 2 years." She ran a finger along the rim of her cup. "I couldn't have imagined being here," she admitted. "When we came west, we thought we'd buy a bit of land. Grow what we could. But the mine took him before we had the chance. My father died under a wagon axle," Wesley said after a moment. "Snowstorm outside Gunnison. I was 15. My mother taught me how to keep things moving after that." Susanna looked at him, surprised. "You were the oldest?" "Only," he said. "She taught me to patch boots, skin rabbits, and never waste a kind word." She looked down, her hands resting on the tabletop. I'm not sure I remember how to be kind without feeling like I'm giving away something I need for myself. You don't have to, he said. Not yet. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Later, after the children were tucked beneath quilts upstairs, Wesley stepped out to check the barn latches. The moon was half full, casting pale light over the ridge. When he turned back, he found Susanna standing just outside the door, shawl around her shoulders. I didn't mean to follow, she said. Just needed air. You're welcome to it, he said, stepping beside her. They stood in silence, the only sound the low rustle of the wind in the grass. Finally she said, You meant what you said. Back at the church. He turned toward her slowly. I don't say what I don't mean. She nodded, arms folded across her middle. I've been trying to hold everything so tight. Afraid if I let go, it'd all fall apart. You've held on long enough, he said, not reaching for her, but standing steady close. No shame in leaning a little. She looked up at him, eyes neither afraid nor certain, but open in a way they hadn't been before. I want to believe in something again, she said. Not just for the children. For me. You can't, he said. And when you do, I'll be standing right here. She didn't speak, but she stepped closer, the edge of her shawl brushing his sleeve. The air between them shifted, warmer somehow despite the wind. And for the first time in months, she let herself breathe without bracing. 3 weeks passed beneath a slow-turning sky. The days held longer light, but the nights cooled sharply, and frosts began to gather at the edges of the pasture grass. Susanna took in the change without complaint, her children quick to follow her rhythm. She mended William's spare shirt with thread Wesley dug from the bottom of a storage trunk, and she taught Stella to gather fallen mesquite beans into a basket for the cow feed. Each task stitched her more firmly into the life they were building, though nothing about it was spoken aloud. One late afternoon, Wesley returned from the canyon trail with a coil of barbed wire and a split lip. He set the coil down by the barn, blood drying at the edge of his mouth. What happened? Susanna asked, walking toward him with sleeves rolled and her hands still dusted in flour. Steer bolted through the brush. Got tangled in the wire I was hauling. Kicked up when I got close. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. I should have seen it coming. She studied his face. Sit down. He hesitated, then lowered himself onto the bench near the tack shed. She fetched clean water from the barrel and tore a strip from the bottom of an old petticoat. When she pressed the cloth to his lip, he flinched just once. You don't talk much when something's wrong, she said, not asking. He looked past her, toward the ridgeline. Talking never fixed much for me. It might not fix it, she said, but it keeps it from festering. He let out a slow breath. When I was a boy, my ma used to say if you're hurt, don't let it make you mean. Just let it make you quiet till it passes. She must have been strong. She never said otherwise. Susanna rinsed the cloth, folding it neatly across her palm. You got anyone left? No. Just this land. She stood, brushing her hands clean. Well, you've got more now. Wesley looked up at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. I don't take that lightly. She didn't smile. Instead, she turned and walked toward the house, her steps slow, deliberate. That night, she hung the children's laundry by lantern glow and lingered long after the last clothespin was set. In the days that followed, they settled into a rhythm deeper than routine. Wesley began showing William how to check the fence line, short walks at first, with the boy carrying a hammer too heavy for his arms. Susanna stayed close to the house, preparing winter stores, her movements purposeful and quiet. One morning, after the frost had burned off and the sun rose warm on the porch, Susanna stepped outside carrying a small wooden box. I found this in the bottom of my trunk, she said. It's for you. Wesley took the box carefully. Inside was a carved tin brooch shaped like a swallow, its wings outstretched. The metal was dulled with age, but the detail was fine, delicate. My husband made it for our first Christmas. He wasn't much for words, but he carved well. Wesley ran his thumb lightly over the edge. You sure? It's not a grave I need to carry with me, she said. He was kind. But he's gone. And you're here. He closed the box gently. Then I'll keep it with care. Later that week, a letter arrived by stage delivered by a man with a mule cart and a weathered hat. Susanna opened it by the stove, her brow furrowing as she read. When Wesley returned from feeding the stock, she handed it to him. My aunt passed. She lived in Kansas, near Abilene. I hadn't seen her in years, but she left a parcel of land, and she named me heir. That surprise you? I suppose, she said. I thought I'd been forgotten. He folded the letter, handing it back. What are you going to do? She paused, then said, I'm not leaving. He didn't respond, but she could feel something shift in the air between them. That night, after the children were asleep, they stood together beside the corral, watching the stars. I used to think I was just living until the next loss, she said. Wesley turned toward her. And now? I think I'm learning how to stay. He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. Her fingers laced with his, firm and sure. There was nothing hurried in it. No need for promises spoken aloud. Just the quiet certainty of two people who had weathered enough to know what it meant to choose each other. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and together they watched the sky until the chill crept in and the lantern light behind the windows called them home. The first snow came early that year, a quiet flurry that dusted the roof and rimmed the water trough with ice by dawn. Susanna stood at the hearth, coaxing the fire higher while Stella traced her fingers through the frost on the window's glass. William sat cross-legged near the stove, sorting through the bundle of dried corn husks Wesley had brought in the day before. Outside, Wesley worked with gloved hands, wrapping wool around the pump handle to keep it from freezing. He moved slower than usual, favoring his right leg, though he hadn't said anything about it. When Susanna stepped outside with a bowl of beans to soak, she paused on the porch, watching the way he tested his weight as he moved. You're limping, she said from the steps. Wesley looked over his shoulder, then straightened. It's nothing serious. She came down, boots crunching lightly over the stiff ground. You didn't favor it yesterday. Slipped in the creek bed, hauling that last fence post. He didn't meet her eyes. Didn't want to worry you. That's not your decision to make, she said, folding her arms. Not anymore. His eyes lifted to hers. You're right. She let the silence sit between them a moment, then nodded toward the barn. Let William take your tools for the next few days. He watches you close. Might as well put it to use. Wesley's mouth tugged into something quiet. You trust him with that? He's not afraid of the work, she said. And I'd like to see him feel useful. He didn't argue. Instead, he passed her the remaining coil of binding twine and said, I'll leave a list. That evening, while the stew simmered and the wind picked up outside, Susanna opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Wesley sat nearby, mending a leather strap with a bone needle. She laid the parcel on the table and unfolded it carefully. You've never seen these, she said, smoothing the corners. Inside were 3 worn pages, lined with fine handwriting. They're from my brother. He stayed behind in Tennessee to help our mother. Sent these after we left. Wesley looked up from his stitching. You haven't written back? I didn't know how to tell him. She hesitated. Everything changed so fast. Then I was here, and I thought maybe it was too far gone. Do you want to write him now? I think I do. He pushed the lantern closer to brighten the table. You can use my paper. It's rough, but it holds ink. She sat down and picked up the pencil he set beside her. I don't know where to start. Start with where you are. That's always enough. She didn't answer, just lowered her head and began to write. The days shortened. Snow came again, heavier this time, and the road into town froze over in places. Wesley hitched the wagon only for what was needed: flour, salt, kerosene. Susanna kept the cabin warm with thick quilts, and the heat of bread baking most mornings. She taught William how to make a simple stitch steady and even, and Stella nestled by the hearth with a spoon and a block of wood, carving nothing in particular but content to mimic the motions. One night, after the children were asleep and the wind had gone still, Susanna stood at the window, her shawl pulled close. Wesley rose from the chair, stretching his shoulder where the old scar from his army days still ached in the cold. "I've been thinking about that land in Kansas," she said, not turning. He stood beside her, his reflection faint in the glass. "You changed your mind?" "No," she said. "But I want to write the lawyer and decline it. I don't need land that far away. Not when I've got this." Wesley looked at her, quiet for a long moment. "You sure?" She turned to face him. "I didn't come here looking for another place to start over. But somehow I did." He stepped closer. "You've made this place different." "So have you," she said. He reached for her hand, callous fingers brushing her wrist. "Susanna, I've never had a woman stay. Most didn't want the quiet. Or the work. Or me. I'm not most," she said, her voice steady. "No," he said. "You're not." She stepped into his arms, the space between them closing without weight or urgency. Her cheek settled against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her like something he never meant to let go. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and soundless. Inside, the warmth held steady, and in the hush of that winter night, they stood together, no longer waiting, no longer wondering, and finally, fully, home. By late February, the cabin roof had shed its last snow, and the earth beneath the sycamores softened enough for boots to leave prints again. The creek, fed by the melting mountain runoff, ran quicker and clearer, carving deeper into its rocky bed. Susanna stood in the doorway one morning, watching as Wesley hitched the wagon with a practiced ease, his breath clouding in the cold. He wore the wool vest she'd patched the week before, and when he tightened the leather collar around his neck, she could see the way his fingers curled stiffly from the cold, and the healed limp he now carried with quiet acceptance. "I need to go into town," he called without turning. "The mill's holding our sack of oats. You want anything?" She stepped onto the porch, arms crossed against the chill. "Take William. He's been asking to see how the mill works." Wesley tipped his head in agreement. "He's ready for a longer ride." Inside, Stella sat on the floor with a wooden hoop and a square of linen stretched taut across it. Susanna had drawn a simple flower for her to follow in red thread. The girl's tongue pressed between her lips in concentration as she worked, her stitches uneven but determined. When Susanna rose to fetch her sewing basket, she paused beside the stove and ran a hand across the back of one of the chairs Wesley had carved. She had begun to think of the cabin not only as shelter but as a place that remembered their hands, what they built, what they carried, what they laid down. The wagon left with a clatter of hooves, and the wind picked up as the sun climbed higher. Susanna cleaned the hearth, then opened the chest where she kept her husband's last few belongings. Beneath a folded flannel shirt was a sealed envelope with her name on it in his careful, slanted handwriting. She sat beside the bed to read it. The note was short, written before the move west. He had known more than he let on about his illness, about how hard it would be for her to carry on alone. He had written only this: "You'll find your way. You always did. Let it be a life, not a burden. That's all I ever wanted for you." Her eyes stung, but she didn't cry. Instead, she folded the letter and tucked it into the back of the ledger where she kept the ranch's accounts. There was space for it there for both the past and what was coming. By the time the wagon returned, the sun had dipped low enough to cast a golden wash across the high grass. William leapt down first, his cheeks red from the wind and his eyes lit with something proud. "I helped load the sack myself," he said, brushing past her into the cabin. Susanna stepped down to meet Wesley. "How was he?" "Didn't flinch once," Wesley said. "Even asked the man at the mill what the pulley weight was. I didn't know myself." She smiled, then reached for the wagon's edge to take a small burlap parcel he held out. From the mercantile, he said. You left a list in the ledger. She took it, weighing it in her hands. Thank you. They stood there a long moment, the wind brushing between them. He reached up, tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear, and then looked at her in that way he had, steady and without question. I've been thinking, he said. About building onto the cabin. A second room, maybe. For privacy. For when the children are older. And maybe a door that doesn't creak like a dying nail in winter. She laughed, soft and surprised. You planning to do that alone? His eyes met hers. No. I was hoping you'd help me draw it out. If this is yours too. She didn't answer. She stepped forward and kissed him, her hands resting just above his ribs, where his warmth met hers. When she pulled back, her voice was low. I'd like that. To build it together. That night, the four of them sat by the fire while the wind quieted outside. Stella fell asleep against her brother's shoulder, and William didn't shake her off. Susanna poured the last of the coffee into Wesley's cup, and their hands met at the rim. No one said anything about love. It didn't need saying. It was there in the way they moved, in every shared task, in the silence between words that no longer needed filling. By spring, the new room was framed. William helped drive nails with a small hammer Wesley had cut down to size, and Stella pressed wildflowers into the wet chinking between logs. Susanna kept the ledger with neat entries, and when the first calf was born, she stitched its name Molly into the corner of the feed sack she'd turned into a pillow for the children's loft. One evening, as the sun set behind the ridge and the light filled the sky with streaks of amber, Wesley took Susanna's hand and led her to the back of the property, where the land sloped down toward the cottonwoods. He stopped beside an old cedar stump and knelt, pulling a small box from his coat pocket. I don't have a ring, he said. Not yet. But I've got this land, and this home, and what I feel for you. She opened the box. Inside was a length of braided horsehair, fine and dark, looped in a circle. I made it from the mare's tail, he said. She's the one that carried you here. Thought it might mean something. Susanna's throat tightened. She took the loop and slipped it over her finger. It means everything, she said. He stood and drew her into his arms, and they stood there while the wind moved gently around them, no longer hollow, no longer carrying the ache of what had been lost, but full instead with the weight of what they had built. Years later, visitors passing through the northern edge of the Arizona Territory would speak of the Rourke Ranch as a quiet place where the fences were straight, the house warm, and the bread always fresh. They would note the carved chairs, the hand-stitched curtains, and the children who worked beside their parents with the kind of ease that comes from being deeply loved. But no one ever spoke as plainly of the way Wesley and Susanna looked at each other across a table, or how they touched hands when passing a tool, or how, when the sun set low behind the barn, they always found their way to the porch, shoulder to shoulder, watching the light fade together. And they never needed to. Because that, too, was a kind of home.